All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining today on building cyber resiliency in a physical world. Just want to let everybody know that this webinar will be recorded. We will follow up after today with a link to view, access, download the recording. So don't feel the need to scribble notes furiously or anything like that. We will send this out. We will send this out afterwards. Note that we do have a Q&A and chat available. So if you have questions throughout, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we will be monitoring those throughout the session today, and we'll get to them. If for some reason we don't get to all the questions, we will follow up after today's session with answers to those. So without further ado, the only thing I will read today and just talk through the description of the webinar, and then we will get into some introductions of the panelists. So cybersecurity leaders have had it figured out for a while. Building resilience is about adapting to threats, adversities, and challenges so a business can continue to meet market demand and stakeholder expectations. Physical security, while a critical piece of the puzzle for businesses with a large physical footprint, has been playing catch up over the years and is finally turning a corner towards building a more resilient presence using cybersecurity principles. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel here. And Gary, let's start with you.
Oh, there you go. Thank you so much, Ryan. Really happy to be here. Yes, my name is Gary Gooden. I'm the former VP of IT for Relative to Space. Prior to that, I was in healthcare for over a decade. I was both a CISO and a CTO, and in an also combined role of many, many years within the life sciences and entertainment and manufacturing areas as well. And just really happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary. Jim?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here as well. I'm Jim Rinaldi. I'm the executive director of an organization with UCLA called Innovate UCLA. Keeps me engaged with many CIOs and CEOs across the SoCal area. But I'm also a former CIO with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, FDA, executives, IT executive for many companies prior to that, including IRS, Marriott for many years, and chemical company before that. So this is a topic that throughout my career I've dealt with in some form or fashion and watched it change over time. So very interesting panel to be with. Thank you.
And for the guy with the best headshot here, Henry.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for having me. It's funny. The tables have turned. Back 6 years ago when you were at Fox, I was thinking 3GC would host you on a webinar. Now I'm on your webinar, so thanks for having me. Henry Park, CEO and founder of 3GC. We've been around for a long time, so this is our 20-year anniversary. I can't believe it. 2003 is when we started, and back then, security used to be in a box, right? And back then, cloud was called co-located services, and so we've evolved a lot. Back in those days, it was a lot of Cisco and a lot of checkpoint type security. But we've evolved from doing blue team, infrastructure security over to looking at security as a cloud centric model, right? And looking at cloud as the perimeter. And today, with the pandemic and everything that's been going on with a lot of the vulnerabilities and hacks these days, we're looking at identity as a perimeter now. So there's definitely been a huge evolution of security over the past 15 years. In the last 5 years, it's been extremely heightened and accelerated in the way that security is being modeled and designed. The frameworks are changing dramatically at a faster pace than we've ever seen it before. And so we've definitely evolved a lot in security. We do a lot of security design. We're doing a lot of automations now through the use of various different tools in automation and implementing DevSecOps into a lot of workflows for our clients. And so this is a very important topic, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, by way of quick background, I'm Ryan Schoenfeld, founder and CEO of HiveWatch. Background in law enforcement, computer crimes, and investigations at both the local and federal level, instructor for the State Department. ran global security technology for Fox Entertainment, as Henry alluded to, before becoming a consultant, starting a managed service practice around physical security, and now run a SaaS software company focused on helping organizations streamline their approach to physical security operations. And to Henry's story, Henry is one of the few people, as I was thinking about a transition from corporate life to entrepreneurship, that was sort of one of the guiding lights for me and what that meant and what it could be. So it's exciting to get to collaborate on stuff as we continue to grow. And 20 years as a startup founder, I can say, is certainly no small feat. So congrats on that as well. So with that, let's jump into the content, because I could sit here and flatter Henry all day. Gary, let's start with you. I think it's important as we get into this topic that we establish a baseline for cyber resiliency as the topic. And so I'll just lob sort of very open-ended, what is cyber resiliency?
Well, my definition of cyber resiliency, and thanks for the question, is really about the ability of an organization to continue its operational cadence, irrespective of the threat. So whether you're talking about defense in depth, whether you're talking about an actual incident management and recovery, it's really about the ability of the organization to keep operating despite threats, despite being under attack. And also, it also is a key component of what I refer to as your business continuity program. And it's also tied to the company's ability to be nimble and agile as well. So that's how I define it.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. I think the agility is a important thing. And what I love about cyber resiliency as a goal is it breaks the silos between departments and domains. And traditionally IT, even within IT department, security was sort of a separate department, right? And not collaborating with help desk and enterprise applications. And so, when we look at cyber resiliency now as more of a business goal to continue and be resilient and operate within various different risk factors, that definitely changes the goal for a lot of departments to integrate with each other and collaborate with each other.
I'll just add to that. I agree with everything I just heard. But something has changed and continues to change, certainly through the pandemic and post-pandemic, where supply chain, your product, depending on what type of company you're in, is at risk. Used to be worried about reputation. You still have to worry about that. So I would include in there that the threats against your products and services from the customer-facing side is also part of the thinking you have to have in a holistic view of security, from the physical all the way through the logical.
Yeah, and I think one of the good transition into our first topic that I want to ask about. I'm here actually at a security conference right now in San Diego, and it's a physical security conference. And I think a lot of what I've experienced in my time in the industry is that it's either physical security or it's cybersecurity. And now I'm starting to see more of a transition to just security. And I think that within the organization, we're seeing a shift of reporting structures and responsibility, wherein historically physical security leaders have reported to facilities and finance and people or legal. And now we're seeing more of a transition to the CTO, the CISO, the CIO, and really building out the security organization as an enterprise function versus historically sort of these siloed technical and physical. But Gary, let's start with you one more time and get your thoughts there.
And I really agree with that sentiment. I think it's also a cultural issue, right? Where you have companies with long established principles of operating, long established silos, and the rate of change that you're seeing is really dependent, I think, on the company's culture and also the sector as well. Sectors that are more mature in their standard practices, we have done it this way, so we'll continue to do it that way. are less susceptible to change at a really fast rate, as opposed to sectors that are a little more nimble, they're more open-minded. So I think that's what you're seeing. I can recount when I was at Seattle Children's, for example, where I combined the physical security side with respect to technology and the cybersecurity side. Why? Because it tied into that whole conversation about cyber resilience, where the traditional silos, I literally broke them all down because the imperative was to protect patient data, to protect employee data, to protect patient health. But you can't do it if you're siloed and your practices aren't aligned. So cyber resilience becomes a team effort. So that trend, I think you're seeing more of that trend, and I think that trend will only continue.
And I think that's particularly interesting in healthcare as a vertical, because from a physical standpoint, we know that that industry, at least in the United States, has one of the highest rates of workplace violence of any other industry. And so as you think about how that couples to overall continuity and resiliency, right, the ability of the organization to keep operating, I think it's more practical in that space than almost anywhere. Jim, you sit on a lot of boards and you work with executives and provide advice and guidance. So from that perspective, how do you approach this?
Well, I think first of all, the organizational structure is not as important necessarily to a board. What they're looking for is, what are you doing to protect the company and to prevent and to quite frankly, manage the risk. And so risk management becomes a topic, certainly at boards. I am seeing an emerging trend, though, and one that I am starting to believe in more and more, and that is combine the cyber and the physical to a chief security officer role that is on peer level with the CIO and CTO. And the focus is the driver there, and the coordination, and to, as Gary mentioned, break down some of the silos that naturally occur when you have an organizational structure. Now, being a former CIO, I had cyber reporting to me, and I've seen where other CIOs, a lot of my colleagues in the national labs, had the physical report to them. So I've seen both models in terms of how that works. Just having where they report by itself doesn't promote, that collaboration or crossover. It still takes a lot of hard work, no matter how the organization is structured. And if you come at it from a risk approach, I really think that helps drive synergy across more than I've seen before. And we can get into that a little later, but I have a lot of thoughts on how you do that. But at the same time, this is some of the trends I'm seeing. CIO still have to play a role. Physical security still has to play their role. Now, how do you bridge the two?
Well, I think you mentioned risk. And so let's talk a little bit more about risk and risk assessment. At the top end of the market, you've got enterprise organizations where it's very common to see risk teams and people on staff who regularly get to assess and advise. But the reality is the vast majority of organizations are not enterprise and may not have those resources internally. And so, Henry, starting with you, what are your thoughts there? How do you advise organizations in cases where they maybe don't have all of the resources internally that a large enterprise might?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so many enterprises are in the same boat. And it's not, you'd be surprised at how many companies are, considered Fortune 500 or public that are still lacking resources, and people are running around playing multiple roles to try to meet all of the cybersecurity risks that exist today. It's just growing at such a rapid pace. But what we've found to work with our clients is formulating a steering committee, because ultimately the cyber risk is something that every C-level now acknowledges is a responsibility. and it's not just a hey informed, you know, in being an informed role. It's actually an accountable role, right, for everyone, the COO, CFO, CEO on down, CMO. And so what's really worked is to get a steering committee and get everyone to agree on what are the risks and how they're going to measure it and measure the progress of managing those risks, instead of just assigning it to one person. And every company is a little different depending on whether the company looks at data as a revenue source or looks at just data as more of an operational cost behind the scenes. And so depending on that and how important the customer data is to that, those risk factors vary. And every industry is a little different. But I think what we've seen work really well is to formulate some form of steering committee and share that responsibility amongst key players in the organization.
I agree with what Henry said. When you start talking about risk, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's the audit committee or the board or the C-suite, if you can identify the risk, and one of the issues is how do you identify a risk and then what do you do about it? And I've seen several methods on that, but the concern I always had is how do you stay informed from external sources as well as internal? And an often missed opportunity is sometimes you have to look at internal threats as well as external threats. And we like to trust all our employees, but sometimes things happen, and whether it's by mistake or whether it's by intentional. And you learn those the hard way. I know a backhoe can disrupt a network that can disrupt operations. Is it intentional? Is it non-intentional? At some point, you figure out, well, how do we prevent that? And you end up with maybe spending some money and having multiple routes. And so, those are the kind of things that you learn over time, but also apply even today in situations. So, risk could be at the minutia level or it could be at the highest level. You still have to find a way to manage through it and think through it. And when you have a team, I think as Henry was pointing out, if you have a team of collaborators who can think about what IT people think very good about the logical side of it. Physical people may think about things that they didn't think about. And so when you bring that together, you'll get the best of thinking, and then bring an external party in too. That gives you an objective view.
I tend to agree with what everybody said. But my only additional comment would be, you should at least start with a baseline. If the organization doesn't have a baseline in terms of how it determines risk, meaning its risk tolerance through a risk register or some such thing, putting steering committees together to collaborate on managing risk for the organization becomes a really difficult task from my perspective. Spent over 10 years as a CISO in healthcare and as a CTO. I've seen this firsthand. But if you have an organization that has a baseline in terms of how they think of risk from a business perspective, then it becomes much easier to do cross-functional collaboration and really start to manage risk as an enterprise action and not an individual department action. You still have to have a primary entity driving the interaction, but at least you will now have a foundation within which to operate.
So I think that's a really good transition, Gary, to sort of, I'll call it the quantification of risk. We have one of our advisors I was speaking with at a security conference a few months ago, and he said that security leaders are just business leaders who wear a security hat, or rather they need to be, rather than being security leaders who sit inside the business, which a lot of times is unfortunately what we see. In terms of quantifying risk and presenting risk to the business, at some point there has to be some way to speak about it in terms that make sense to the business and is not just the if-then statement of, if we don't do this, then this will happen, versus how does security become an enabler to the business? How do you align how you look at risk and quantify risk and tie it to business drivers and business objectives and things that CFOs and CEOs and COOs will recognize as not just the if-then statements, but like security can actually be a business enabler. How have you found success? I'll start with you, Jim, in driving those types of conversations.
I think, well, business enabler is an interesting one to start with. Again, you don't want to lead with we've mitigated all risks, but you may go with we protect your data, and this is how we protect your data, and the customer side of it has to feel they can trust, and so building trust is to me is the logical way to get to adding value in retention, quite frankly, adding customers and retention to those things. I do want to point out that for me, the most effective way that we found to communicate, and I added something to it, was the 5x5 matrix. And whereas the upper right-hand quadrant was the most likelihood and most impactful or most consequences, I added a third sort of think of the z-axis to it with maturity or preparedness, or mitigation is probably a better word, and how mitigated you are. And if you have that designed properly, it's a great way of conveying, your risk management strategy, certainly to the highest risk and as far as you really want to go. And I found that to be most effective.
So I have go ahead, Henry.
So one of the things about communicating about risk and it's really tough when you're looking at it from a technology standpoint. Technologists are going to look at configuration, and we're going to look at the risk of, what's the probability of being hacked, right? Looking at it from a configuration standpoint and actually the practicality of, how likely is it that we're going to get hacked, right? But then translating that into business talk about, typically they're going to want to look at it from a hard cost perspective or a soft cost perspective. The thing that's easy to do is the hard costs, right? Probably the CFO is going to dictate that, and there's going to be a culture around the business on what is acceptable as hard costs, right? When they're thinking about ROI or figuring out operating cost factors and whatnot. The harder discussion is about soft costs and soft costs that needs to be agreed upon by everyone. That it needs to be a steering committee type of discussion where everyone agrees on, what these kind of soft costs are. Well, let's factor that into our decision making, and that needs to be a group decision.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Gary. You look like you're going to say something.
I was just gonna top off what Henry was saying by going back to that whole notion of the baseline. Because without that baseline, then it's really difficult to have the soft cost discussion. And yeah, I think Henry is correct. It has become a quote unquote group consensus as to what soft costs are in terms of what the tolerance is to understand where you're going to invest.
So I want to talk a little bit about like effectively communicating risk and how you do that, and also how you do that taking in mind both the physical and cyber side. And there's a story I've been telling lately, and so I apologize if you've heard me tell it before, but I really like this example of a chief security officer that works for a large global retailer, and he wanted to add a film to the exterior of all the retail stores, and is a film that protects against vandalism, against blast, against intrusion. And that was a hard story to tell to the leadership team, because most people don't resonate with the idea that there could be a street level explosion or that these different things could happen, because it's not talking in the sense of risk that most leaders understand. However, where I think this security leader was brilliant was he did a lot of research about the secondary benefits of the film and realized that by applying this film to all the exterior windows of the store, their HVAC costs to cool the stores in the summer and to maintain the temperatures would decrease the business operational spend by a huge 7 or 8 figure number and actually led with that as the driver for the conversation versus, you know, the security implications of the film were sort of secondary to the conversation, that we also get this benefit, but really we're driving our environmental initiative. We're looking at LEED certification. We're looking at cost to operate. And then, yes, there's also this security component. And so when you're going and talking to leadership, how do you effectively communicate these things, and how do you bring the cyber and physical together in the conversation? Because really it needs to be communicated as this cohesive package rather than as these individual initiatives, or sort of the platform versus the product approach. I open that to all of you.
I'm happy to jump in. So I want to talk about it from the healthcare perspective, then I'll talk about it from a non-healthcare perspective. From a healthcare perspective, I think it becomes an easier conversation to have when you frame the conversation around reputational risk. So for instance, if a healthcare organization has a data breach, for argument's sake, you have now impacted reputation, so you have reputational risk. If you have an active shooter situation in a healthcare environment, which to your earlier point, has somebody's made a comment, has occurred several times, you impact reputational risk. When you have compromise of medical pumps through malware injection, that can potentially risk the life of a patient who might be hooked up to 10 different types of IVs, that's reputational risk. So if you have reputational risk, then you can draw a direct line between reputational risk and the viability of the organization. So that's the way I tended to deal with it in the healthcare environment. In the recent non-healthcare environment, it was really around resilience from the manufacturing perspective, which is time dependent. So therefore, resilience, if you didn't have resilience baked into the manufacturing process, now you're impacting the bottom line in terms of just the profitability of the enterprise. When it comes to physical security and cybersecurity integration, I think you also have to think of it in terms of the non-traditional way of looking at IT from an OT perspective. So physical plant safety, life support systems, those things are all vectors, potential vectors, as is quote unquote physical intrusion, anomaly detection. So therefore, if you think about those three components, cyber resilience in respect to physical security integration, with respect to OT integration into the technology stack, and the ability to actually monitor those environmental variables, then I think you're in a better situation.
So let me double down and ask you a question, and I'll follow up with the same question for each person. So, I mean, great feedback. How do you measure ROI then on these initiatives when you're talking about this internally? At the end of the day, it's a business, right? And there's got to be numbers tied to suggestions and spend.
Yeah, so which is why I made the comment earlier about having a baseline in terms of what your risk tolerance is. Once you have an agreed upon baseline, i.e. your corporate risk register, so the organization now has a determinant on how it wants to view risk. Okay, then the organization is going to depend on you to come back to them with a strategic roadmap of how you're going to address risk in terms of highest prioritization of risk. And then once you do that, there's a cost component ascribed to each type of risk and as it regards to the prioritization of the risk. Then it becomes a discussion point. You could then really have the potential to have a rebaseline based on the actual cost required to hit the original baseline. So it actually becomes an iterative conversation. And that's the way I've tended to deal with issues like that in the past, if that makes sense.
It does. And before I jump to you, Jim, I just want to remind folks that we have the Q&A section. We have a great question that we'll get to here in a few minutes, but please use the Q&A section to submit any questions, because we will be saving time at the end here to get to those. Jim?
Yeah, I'll add that, I haven't yet figured out how to do ROI on insurance, but so there's a little bit of art and magic to ROI in IT or in cybersecurity. And so we did baseline, as Gary was talking about. We did look at our costs per incident, and we knew how to measure that. And then as technology shifts, as the threats shift, can you scale that to become a reasonable, trusted number? Quite frankly, it's very hard to do. But people understand if you talk in terms of what the impact could be, and how you could manage the costs. We typically didn't have any problem getting investments to improve security. So while I think ROI is important, I would be a little more careful and maybe look at return on attention or return on some other things to make sure that you're measuring it right, because unfortunately economics can make bad decisions, and I've seen that too. If you're so risk averse, you might spend more money than you should. If you're not risk averse enough, you might spend too little, and then you'll pay for it later. It's good to have the baseline. It's good to continue to update that baseline as the threats change. And I can tell you from a board standpoint, if you spend too much money, you can be fired. If you spend too little and you have more impact, and you have a threat that take Sony or take Target many years ago, it may cost your job. So you really got to look at it a little different than you would justify buying a large mainframe or a large set of computers or building a data center or something like that. There are many ways I think you have to look at. Also, it depends on the company, and if it's a CFO driven type company, no disparagement to the CFOs, then you probably do have to have some cooperation helping to find that. If you're a startup and if you're a company that is going to be doing bleeding edge things, you may look at it a little differently, that we just got to have this and find a way of doing it. And then I'll finish with this. One thing that I've noticed that you really have to look at today is because we're buying more online services, SaaS platforms, cloud computing, and things like that. Turns out your contract is going to be a big factor, not only in what you spend on that service, but how you do cybersecurity, and in some cases physical security, because you need to include that in there.
Well, I'll say selfishly, as somebody who sells a SaaS platform, there is a significant part of our sales process, which is education. And a lot of the education revolves around business case. And we spend a lot of time getting in the weeds with folks on program data and helping build a business case, because in our realm, that hasn't been done historically in terms of how you pitch the value of a product or a software to leadership and thinking holistically across the program. Henry, we had a question that came in that I'll start with you. In your role at 3GC, you advise a lot of companies in different verticals and different levels of scale. So there's a question here: how do you determine an acceptable budget for security costs? Is it a percentage of revenue or profit? Are there some industries where the percentage should be higher or lower? So I'll start with you on that one.
Man, that's tough.
Question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Typically, what we see is cybersecurity gets jumbled into overall IT budget, and it's a percentage. And when executives are looking at overall budgeting for IT, they typically look at it for percentage of revenue, right? Whether it's 1% to 2%, maybe 3%, and then if they're they've got a lot of digital business capabilities that are generating revenue, it really jumps up to like 5 to even 10%, depending on how much revenue is coming from digital and data. And so typically we see cybersecurity as a sub bullet of overall IT budget. But I wanted to get back into the past question that I wanted to throw in some perspective in. I want to shake things up a little bit and be a little politically, I'll go across the grain politically. And and I want to
You'll be
emphasize,
on the internet forever, Henry.
this is the day we're going to shake things up between the CFO and the COO. So what I found to work is to really understand whether the CEO is more sales focused or more operationally focused. And the CEO who's going to be operationally focused is probably going to look more, is going to look at all the factors around ROI the way a CFO would look at it. And the CFO is going to look at it, and I'm overgeneralizing here, right? And I'm picturing, two opposing sides diametrically fighting with each other, and I'm not saying it's always that way, but CFOs tend to look at things. Yeah, and Gary, you mentioned it, which was probably the most typical way of calculating ROI, is to look at, hey, what happens if operations stop, and how much is it going to cost the business if we stop selling a product, by hour, by day, right? That's probably the most common way to come up with some sort of ROI factor, right? But then, when you're dealing with a CEO who's very sales focused, then they're going to start looking at a lot more of the soft benefits, and reputation's a really big part of marketing, and so for me, my recommendation is to really understand what motivates the CEO, and from a top-down perspective, see what he's going to back. Because ultimately, this is a decision that needs to be made at every C level.
So it sounds like all roads lead back to business drivers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are the business drivers? Yeah.
So there's another question here around budget and cost, and I know we're not in the Q&A section, but they're good questions, so I want to get to them. And I'll point this to Gary and Jim here. Earlier in this meeting, there was a discussion about how a steering committee can help mid-enterprises with limited budgets manage security. But when you need expertise in different kinds of security issues, how do you control the potentially massive cost of a holistic security strategy?
It's a great question, for which there is no silver bullet type answer, quite frankly.
This is the consultant, it depends answer?
It 100% depends. Again, I think it depends on the risk appetite. And it also depends on whether or not you're the kind of technology leader that the business tends to listen to. If the business tends not to listen to you, then you're probably the wrong messenger. It's going to be very, very hard to have that discussion. So I think reputation within the organization is really important, meaning your reputation, to have those types of hard conversations. I don't know what enormous costs mean, if it's a percentage of revenue exceeding 10%, whatever it is. But again, it comes back to understanding what not just what the budget is, but understanding the total cost of implementation against the prioritization of how you define risk. So it's just one of those questions. It's a depend question. It's a very nuanced question, which is really complicated.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, costs can be scalable. So if you scale it and reduce the risk in other ways, and maybe simplify in the business architecture might be simpler, the technical architecture might simplify, reduce complexity of the organization. If you have every technology known to mankind, how are you going to protect all of that? So that's going to cost a lot of money. So reduce the risk and reduce the number of technologies you use. Or I remember in the days we built an IoT network, and we didn't really fully understand the risk of Raspberry Pis on our IoT network. Turns out they're computers too, and they could be hacked. And so, you learn from that, and you scale the cost to to handle that. In a lot of cases, especially in smaller or mid-sized companies, you're going to have a lot of sunk cost where people have to wear many hats. And then it becomes a cost management and prioritization. So where do you put your efforts? And if you're a customer-facing type organization, then maybe you're going to protect and spend your efforts on making sure that that transaction from the customer is secured more than you, or reasonably more than you would put, say, in the back office systems. So you really have to come at it from, there's a little bit of art to understanding how the business works and where the priorities are, and then get buy-in from the business. This is where we're going to put our effort, doing reasonable approaches, even in back office in the example I was given.
Yeah. I want to add to something both of you guys are talking about, and add some practicality to it. As much as I agree with it, it depends on the question is a loaded question, right? Because it really depends on the risk registry and what the agreements on those risks are. But one of the things I've found to be really helpful is I think CEOs, the C level who doesn't understand the technology, they get turned off by having this big gloomy story about how cybersecurity is going to cost so much and we have to do it right, and we have to get big budget for it. That typically gets looked at as, Jesus, they don't understand business, right? The practical side to it that I think has worked is if you look at it from a cyber resiliency standpoint and get everyone to realize, hey, you know what? We're never going to be like 100% bulletproof. The reality is we're going to get hacked. It's just a matter of when. And then you get everyone to realize, all right,
and how bad, when and how bad,
and get everyone to realize it's not a matter of trying to block everything and spending a lot of money on that, right? Because there's a lot of money wasted on trying to get it right, and there's so many governance frameworks and trying to get that checkbox 100-page assessment out and try to get everything right based on the NIST framework or CIS 18, and get a lot of high-paid consultants to go in here to use an academic view of how how a company should get it right. You spend tons and tons of money on that, but when you have the stance of letting the executives know, you know what, that's a waste of money, and there's a portion of that we have to do to get insurance and get compliant or whatnot. I realize that, but we have to join forces to realize we're going to get hacked. It's just a matter of when and how bad, and let's come up with the plan to limit that risk. It's not about trying to keep every hacker out. It's about limiting the rest of when they do come in. It's a small small risk.
I do think, if I could weigh in one more time, I do think that tracking and looking at where companies are going with some of the AI capabilities is going to allow you to reduce costs and reduce some of the risk. And I'm very hopeful with that. And what I'm seeing with some large systems integrators in particular, they're buying into that quite a bit, and companies will benefit and reduce labor costs. So you could see a more secure environment with less labor thrown at the environment because the data is so much. There's so many monitors around that I'm hopeful that a newer technology, like I'm seeing either with AI ops or other sets of automation, will provide that benefit.
So
I just want to make one point. I think the key to all of that, though, really comes back to one, getting everybody to agree on what the risks are, and then also, if you're going to try and upsell technology to a CEO who is more sales focused, then you have a problem. It's more about how you're going to effectively minimize what I refer to as technical debt. There was a point that Jim had made earlier about not having 10,000 different things, but simplifying your environment as best you can. Yep. And then baking in governance around that. Once you can at least have some sort of quote unquote set of mitigating controls, some level of defense in depth, you're simply making it harder for attackers to do what they need to do. And then you can start to measure off, is this good enough? Back to your point, Ryan, that it's just a matter of time.
And I think, you've got your risk register, you've prioritized what the risks are. I live in startup world now, which means a lot of things, but it means we're always budget constrained and we always have a million things that we need to do. And so there's a mantra that we live by, which is just start. And you can spend all the time in the world circling around everything that you can do, but at a certain point, you just have to start with something. And once you have the risk identified, and once you've prioritized the things that are most important, or the things that are mission critical, or the things that can be career ending or business ending, or we can't sell our product if we don't meet this compliance requirement. Like those are the things that you've got to knock out. Those are table stakes for your business. And just start with those, and then start knocking down the next things on the list. But most organizations are not in a position to do everything at once, and so it becomes that prioritization. I want to end on two topics. One that's near and dear to my heart. There's a question here around career development. And then I want to end with a fun one, which is industry trends. And Jim started talking about AI a little bit, so I want to lean into that. But first, we've got a question here that says, I consider myself an intelligence professional making a career in corporate security, enterprise risk management, uncertainty management spheres. Physical security standards, tech, et cetera, was something I needed to familiarize myself with along the way. But how well do I need to familiarize myself with cybersecurity standards and hard skills to be able to contribute effectively across both dimensions?
I would say it depends on who you're talking to. If you're trying to impress the CIO and someone in the IT department, there's a lot that you need to learn there. If you're looking to impress the COO or CFO, I think it's more in the lines of understanding the business.
Yeah, I would agree with Henry's comment, because it really depends on who his audience is. They comment about physical security as an area needs to familiarize himself with. It sounds as if it's the kind of situation where you kind of want to understand what access control technologies there might be, proximity sensor technologies, where those might be, weapons detection technologies, where those might be, and how those are integrated back into the security stack. So it really depends on the industry is in and what he's trying to accomplish, is what I would say.
I think something I would add is it's great to learn lots of stuff, but know what you don't know and when you need to bring in help and advisors. And some of the best security leaders in the space are great at presenting messages and sort of communicating at the leadership level, but also know when it's time to bring in backup. And that, one of the things I see a lot are people having to know everything and be experts at everything and end up being experts at nothing. Teamwork
Ryan,
makes the dream work, right?
And Ryan, this is something, regardless of technology, if you're someone who has good judgment, that's a good starting point, because you're going to be faced with all kinds of information. I don't care if you have a musical degree, or you're not a computer scientist or a physical security expert. Good judgment applies across the board. And my recommendation, anybody coming up the ranks, is get a mentor, find people you want to follow, and learn from them as well. And intelligence is not always measured on outcome. It's your adaptability and your desire and your dream to achieve something that really matters, in my opinion.
Awesome. So this next question is going to lead us into our topic around trends. So I'll start with the question, but I also want to talk about AI. I want to talk about biometrics. In the physical security realm, we talk about facial recognition, and there's a lot of data privacy concerns there. Jim, you started talking about AI as a force multiplier and an efficiency tool, which is something that we spend a lot of time on. But let me start with this question. A major security effort trending this year, according to recent CIO surveys, is continuous threat exposure management. What do you see as the key element that makes up a continuous threat exposure management strategy?
Well, I know that I was briefed from three-letter agencies, even when I didn't want to be. So you can get information that way. We also had experts who knew how to navigate through the dark web to a certain degree, and so you could find things. For me, it was making sure, at JPL in particular, when we had an event, whether it's a landing or a launch, that our protections were up much higher and our reconnaissance was better, much more improved around that. But the strategy says, don't internalize it only. Take external data at wherever you can get it, and utilize that to internalize your mitigation strategy.
Yeah, I think continuous threat exposure management is something that's evolving primarily because of AI, right? And there are several companies out there that they're doing this at some scale. If you think about it in the traditional sense, if you're looking at, say, perimeter pen testing, that was something you might do from a regulatory perspective once or twice a year, and then you quote unquote mitigate the findings therein, right? Nowadays, when you talk about continuous threat adherence, you're looking at technologies that are constantly looking at TTPs, constantly looking at key threat indicators, and then looking at those in relation to the kind of business that you're trying to defend against. So that to me is just a trend that's just going to continue.
Yeah,
So-
that question, man, you could spend a lot of money on that. A lot of money on that, and there's a lot of AI around seams and but I would say, man, again, coming up with that baseline like Gary was talking about, and really figuring out what the business agrees is a level of continuous monitoring that they're willing to spend on. That's really important, because you don't want to be looked at as the technologist who doesn't get it, is wanting to spend a whole lot of money on something that maybe the business doesn't agree to spend that kind of money on.
Henry, you're right. I will challenge a little bit the fact that it's hard for business executives who are focused on whether it's sales or whatever aspect of the business to keep up with emerging technologies and things like that. So I think it's the CTO, CIO, even the CISO, I think, need to educate what the potentials are and what are the threat of the unknowns. There's a lot of threats being identified potentially with AI. I will tell you, the emerging things like quantum computing is going to change the dynamics of encryption and things of that nature. And the flow of data, we're now talking getabytes, which is, by the way, 10 to the 30th of data management. So how do you continue to be the same way when all these are happening potentially to your business, and how do you educate the C-suite so they understand what we're talking about now?
Yeah.
And I do agree, turn it into business terms is a better language to start with.
Yeah, but to Henry's point, it becomes a serious cost discussion at some point, right?
It is, and I also don't want to be shooting myself in the foot, because that's where we make our money, is implementing these types of tools and whatnot. But to add to what I was saying, I would say it's more important to focus on getting some sort of continuous monitoring of those threat exposures, utilizing a lot of the tools out there and a lot of the automations out there, versus spending a whole lot of money on a really big, a big four type consulting assessment.
Yeah,
that looks at a snapshot of a point in time, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, say, a managed SIM, for example, and your events per second, right? EPS cost. So you have to measure EPS against what the indicators are relative to your quote unquote external threat landscape. Once you understand that, then you can ratchet your costs accordingly. So that's just one example.
All right.
That's
Quick
awesome.
time for a quick fun round robin. We have a software company. We sell AI for optimizing security programs. On the topic of trends, quick round robins, no more than 30 seconds each. What is an emerging trend in AI and security that each of you are most bullish on right now? We'll start with Gary.
Two things: augmented intelligence and AI-powered threat detection. Augmented intelligence is as simple as something like what you currently see today with, say, Alexa or Siri, right? Which is just virtual assistants, but it's really using the data to help you make decisions. And then with threat detection, it's really about addressing the issue of workforce intelligence. So you marry good people with good AI equals good results. So those are the two things.
Awesome. Henry.
Well, mine's not going to be very sexy. The big trend we're seeing is this move over to redesigning security from an identity as the perimeter standpoint. And from that trend, one of the big things is laser focusing on getting the onboarding and offboarding right. And this is a collaborative effort, right? Not just from IT, but with HR and facilities and operations, really getting that right, because man, that gets missed a lot. It's onboarding and offboarding people.
Ties closely to physical access and everything as well.
Yeah.
Jim, yours.
Yeah, real quick. I first of all, one day we'll actually get rid of passwords. I think that would be a good start. And I think the physical side comes in, that they are sometimes the front line or sometimes the response. And then I will throw in with AI, look at behavioral aspects of AI. The fact that you could see when anonymous behavior or some other kind of behavior happens, and then you look at that as a potential threat. And those tools are here, they're growing, and it's going to get more interesting. But I happen to believe that, we didn't talk about operational technology very much, but that is often an easy point of entry if it's ignored. And so the technology, I think, to digitize those kind of capabilities, but contain that digitalization, good onboarding, I think really helps with that. But I think those are things that, come to mind ahead of time.
Well, maybe that's our next topic, and we get the band back together for another conversation. I want to quickly thank you all for joining on the panel today. I think it was a really fun conversation. With our last 30 seconds here, Henry, what is 3GC Group?
3GC is an IT enabler focused on cyber resiliency.
Now it is.
Ultimately, we're a bunch of tech geeks that like to build stuff. So if you guys want to build something cool around cybersecurity into your operations, give us a call.
Awesome. Thank you all again for joining, and thank you once again to the panel. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Great. Thank you.